And now we are ready to start using Biograph functionality to check how to set up a network graph. For this purpose, let me do the following. First, hopefully everybody has checked according to the instructions whether the Biograph functionality is available for you. And we do this by just typing Biograph and pressing returned. And if the bioinformatics toolbox is set up, we'll get a Biograph object with, in this case, 15 nodes and 24 edges. And the exact numbers might be different in your case because there's by default a random graph being set up if you don't specify anything else. So in my case, this is working, and if it doesn't work for you, you can't unfortunately do the exercise with me now, but you'll be able to do it later once you have that implemented. So one thing that I would like to warn you about is, as you can see, we are using in our code, we are using assignments and giving names to certain variables. So we assign the name MM, in this case, to the matrix generated. What you would like to do is to avoid calling something graph. And the reason why you should avoid is if you type in help graph, you will see that actually the name graph is taken for something else. And I don't go into this. There's a function called graph, so it would be confusing if you would call something a graph, and this is something that you can see. To avoid this, give it another name, call it graph1 or call it mygraph, but graph is already taken. And as you could see, just using help graph is one way of finding out whether a name is taken. If there's help information, then of course this functionality has been assigned a name already. So let's go. Let's use our matrix, the one that we have created previously, which we call MM, and let's take a look at it and use Biograph for this purpose. So if rather than calling it now graph, we create a Biograph object by using what we have already learned, namely the functionality Biograph. But now, rather than giving it no argument, we specify that we want to have it applied to the network matrix MM defined above. So assigning Biograph of MM to GR will create a Biograph object which is called GR and which will then be in our working memory available for further things. Next thing that you have probably seen, if we want to give it a name, maybe my plot, we can call it PL, and we want to of course make a plot. So rather than previously we have used plot functionality, what we use in the bioinformatics toolbox is view. And we apply view to what we have already defined, namely the object GR, which we obtained from applying Biograph to MM. So the sequence of events will first create the matrix, and if I put in the comments in here, create Biograph object, and the last thing that we get is create plot. So let's see if this was successfully done. If you execute this piece of code, and I'll show it back in a minute, what we can see here, if that is bioinformatics toolbox set up properly, MATLAB will create with certain default values to make decisions about the location of each node and the arrangement of the arrows connecting things between them, create your network graph for you. And you can see it's being set up nicely to some extent, not so nice to another extent, and we'll learn more about these functionalities in a second. So an important thing that we want to address here, and I can imagine that because this graph is maybe you have a not too big screen, you will be hardly able to read what is written in the individual nodes. So the letter size is very small. So when we start our sort of learning how to manipulate each of the elements in this graph and make it the way that we want to have it by, if I just click this graph away, by using a couple of commands. And the first thing that we want to do, modify font size. Because we think that's a bit meager and it's a bit poor, we want to have it a bigger font. How do we do this? So if you want to do it from the script, what you use is set functionality. So you can apply to the object that you have created, namely the graphical object, which is called PL, or our plot that we have created. We want to now modify things, and we have a unique way of doing this using set functionality. So the first thing we have to refer to the plot object. It's called PL, so I need to specify it in the set functionality as a first argument. Plot can be sub-specified in either nodes or edges. Which one do you want to change? Do you want to change the nodes or some property related to nodes? Then what you do is plot.nodes, in this case with a capital N. Second argument, then we specify that we want to access the font size. Font size, this argument needs to be put in single quotes, and you can see it's highlighted in my case in purple. It's the MATLAB default color, saying this is property of the nodes in the object PL that we want to have modified. Separated by another comma, you can then specify the font size, maybe giving it 20, and that's PT. And what we can do is, if we just execute our code again, just run the whole script as it is, we can see that now we have the graph plotted, but the default font size of each of the nodes has been extended to be larger than it was previously. If you feel that in this case node number 1 is extremely important and you want to have it even bigger, how would you do that? You can use the same command, but rather than specifying just nodes, you can access each of the nodes individually, in this case by putting it in round parentheses. Node number 1 would be nodes in parentheses 1. That would change the font size of node number 1. And if we make that bigger and execute the code, you can see now it's exaggerated. It's even so big that it almost goes outside of the box. So it's easy. So maybe that was a little bit too much. We make it not so much, or we can just leave it the same thing as before. So we have uniform size number, but this is a way to give different font sizes to individual nodes. So I think, and that was the modification of the font size of node names. So what we can do now is we can also use a very similar structure to modify a property of an edge, say color of edges. I want to change, just plot color. No, that's not true. Whereas the British way it's written like this. If we want to modify the color of edges, how would we go about it? So we know that we had all edges in the same color. Well, we use the same set functionality. And rather than addressing nodes, we are addressing the edges of that plot object called PL. And our corresponding property is now a property of the edges, so something that belongs to the edges. And the color is called line color, and now color is written the American way. If we want to specify what color it will be, that's an important thing. We need to give it an array of 3 numbers. So the array of 3 numbers, 3 numbers that are somewhere between 0 and 1, including 0, including 1. And the object is according to the RGB conventionality. RGB, I put it up here, red, green, blue. So you have it red if only the first number is 0, and if the first number is 1 and the other 2 are 0, and you would have it blue if the first 2 numbers are 0 and the last one is 1. Right, so we can just test it. If we plot our object, because I have just set edges, I haven't specified which edge, all of the edges are now plotted in blue. Taking the graph away again, and as before, of course, we can have the idea that one of the edges is very significant. So maybe we think the first edge is extremely significant, such that we want to indicate this by a different color. And if we have the first value 1 and the other value 0, 0, we would have it assigned a red value, because the first number refers to the amount of red in that array. So we can execute our code again. We can see which edge is the first one. It's the one that goes from node number 1 to node number 2. It's now plotted in red. So if I take it away again. So we have seen how these things go, and I think you'll be able to do further inquiries if you look in the code for this Biograph exercise, the code that you can download from the Materials tab in your control panel. You will be able to see more options, and at the end there's also a link to the MATLAB web page that gives you all the options that you have. So there's many things that you can do using the set functionality as we have tried it here, and I don't want to go through all of them, because that would be a very lengthy exercise and not a very interesting one, because you will be able to find what you're looking for much quicker by going to that help site. And I'm also going to show you in a second a shortcut of how you can do all of this without needing to put any code in the script. However, a final thing that might be of interest, and if I just copy one of the lines here and I say I want to modify, that is the shape of node representation. The shape of the node representation, I can modify this in a very similar way, and I copy from above code set, and I want to access all of the nodes, so I will now change all of them, but you know you can also do it individually. But what we want to be able is to change the shape of the way the node is represented, and the way to do this is to tell MATLAB that this is now called shape. That's the option to access the shape property of the nodes in that graphical object. And one thing that is different from the rectangle that we have here by default is the ellipse. So if I type in ellipse and I close this by closing the parentheses nicely, then what we should get here, while the graph will start and putting it all into the rectangles that we saw before initially, it will then override this and modify this functionality by setting the shape to something different. And we'll first check by executing this code whether it has worked. This is what the ellipse look like. So now we have 5 nodes in the shape of an ellipse. We have a font size that is more appropriate to the graph, and we have also seen how to change colors, in that case, of the arrows. And this is just an example. Of course, also the node background or the color of the name that appears in the node can all be accessed, but we're not going to do this in detail now. So let me now sort of stop this. So we have looked into the graphical object from this code here, from our script file where we have created what we wanted, and we have used this script in order to manipulate our MATLAB Biograph object. Now what we can do here is something that's a little bit more elegant than what we have done, namely this graph object is interactive. And this is the final thing that I wanted to show to you, because it might not be so obvious initially. We want to see that in this we can access anything that we need to change about this, about the way this network is displayed directly from the graph. So interactive, the interactivity, and how we do go about doing this. If you have a node in that window, you can click on it. If you click on a node, and you can see here, it was surrounded by this bluish ellipse before. Having clicked on it, it's surrounded by red, and red means it's selected. So having selected a node, I can go over it with the mouse, and if I click on it and pull it, I can actually move it to another place. Right? So you don't need to set the position of that node from the script window, which you can do. You can look it up. It's a set property that is possible, but you can also do it by just clicking on it, and then wherever you want to have that node, you can pull it. So that's nice. There is a bit of a drawback here, namely, as you can see, this pushing it around has messed up my arrows. So what you do is what you do in order to address this mess that it has created, you click somewhere in the window and apply a right click. And if you now choose the third option, which is here, refresh edges, you will see that the nodes stay in a similar position to before, but MATLAB has addressed and put the arrows nicer than before. The interesting thing here is now that 2 arrows are one above the other, because there's a node, there's an edge from node 1 to 2, but also from 2 to 1. So that's why we have an arrow now with 2 arrowheads, differently colored. So this is one thing. So we have positioned the nodes differently, and after refreshing it, we can have also the arrows adjusted. If I go back to that node again and select it, there's more that I can do, namely, I can give it a right click on that node. And if you can see that window now at the bottom of my screen, there is something called the node properties. And if you select node properties and click on them, what you get is access to all of the properties of the nodes, and you can address everything here without using set, just directly making something happen from within this inspector, which is called the inspector of the Biograph nodes. So for example, you remember that previously we looked at the font size and we changed the font size. You can now see that there's a number associated with it, which is 20, which is what we have done. We have assigned 20. And if you want to have that much bigger, then because node 1 is highlighted, you can actually do it from here. And going back to our plot, we can see that the node 1 is now in that bigger, with that bigger font size. And you might have seen, if I just go back very briefly to the node properties, that there's also a way to change the background color, which is now this yellow. And if you click on that symbol for the color, you can actually go and manipulate sliders and give it a different background color. So take this property away, and as such you will have access to all of the node properties interactively directly in the graph, and it might make it more convenient for you to do all this. Yes, thank you for reminding me. Some of the functionality is not available in much older versions of MATLAB, so you will have to check if you don't have 2016 as I have done. You need to check, but similarly, the functionality that was there from the beginning, the highlighting of a node, possibility to move it around, and using either on the node or going above the edge, the right-click edge properties will be available on right-click selecting a specific edge. So either way will work. Either use set functionality in the script or do it interactively if you have this possibility with this version of the Biograph viewer. So we're getting close to the end of this. Let me summarize what we have done today. We have first looked at the possibility of having a plot expanded into a pseudo 3D plot, namely using the plot function plot3, and you have the MATLAB code to do this. We have then looked into how to set up a network matrix, the square matrix that represents how are nodes connected according to information that you get from biology. And we have then used Biograph, one of the functionalities of the MATLAB bioinformatics toolbox, in order to display the graph and to be able to manipulate the visualization. So, and before we conclude this, I should also mention that, of course, there are different ways of doing this as well. There are options available for download on your computer, like you did with your MATLAB installation. One of them is called Cytoscape. So I just mentioned this. If somebody wants to look it up, something that you can install and use to plot it. So you can also set up your network matrix and put it into other softwares in order to use other functionalities that might be more convenient to handle, for example, large graphical objects. We also have a session, an optional session that is available for you if you want to go and do a bit of a more advanced use of Biograph, where you can then actually see how not only is the network plotted, but also how it can be used to ask biological questions to that network display.